I see that I know. It's great to see all of you here this evening. So what we're going to talk about is this article that I published about 6 weeks ago called "The Storm is Here: Seven Threats Every Music and Arts Educator Must Understand Right Now." And the idea behind this was, as Wendy was saying, just trying to there were so many things that were happening in so many different places that were not directly connected, but certainly were having an impact on education or had the potential to have an impact on education. And that's why I started to work on this. I actually started working on this in the summertime. And then as new information came out, was able to put the pieces together. So I'm happy to be here to present this for all of you. I'm going to preface this by saying that this is a briefing and not a eulogy. This is about getting you engaged, but not a reason to despair. In order to be an effective advocate, you have to know what the landscape is. And so what I'm going to do today is paint for you what the landscape is that we're dealing with, and not just as it relates to music and arts education, but it's impacting all of education. And that's the piece that I think that you have to be aware of. And that with that knowledge, then you can then devise appropriate strategies on how do you address some of these things. Now, not everything that I'm going to talk about is a problem in New Jersey yet. And I emphasize yet because it could be. Some of them may not be ever. But you have to be aware of what is happening and how all these things come together. So I'm going to start back in 1991. U.S. Secretary of Education Lamar Alexander, in a letter to music educators and arts educators when they were lobbying for the inclusion of the arts in our national education goals, he called the arts extracurricular. And that really galvanized the music and arts education community to push back. And what followed was 3 years of organized advocacy, Grammy Awards broadside from Mike Green, and a protest concert in Lamar Alexander's hometown. All of those things led to adding music and arts in 1994 to be codified in federal law as a core academic subject for the first time in history. So this is 1991. We fast forward to 2026, and we have a different word, but the same meaning. In the budget appropriations that were put out by the federal government, in there they called music and arts education distractions. These are distracting from our what we should be focused on in school, which is language arts literacy, math, and science. And in addition to that, it actually escalated even further, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But what I want to show you is that they were wrong in 1991 when they were calling the arts extracurricular, and they're wrong now when they're calling it a distraction. And through this lens, I'm going to be focusing on a lot of this is informed by what we've learned from the music community, but it really does apply to everything else. So what we're going to talk about are the seven threats, and these are the seven threats: federal funding, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the cost spiral, the enrollment cliff, the educator pipeline, the narrowing of the curriculum, and state tax reform, and how all of these things are coming together, putting pressure on our education system, and as a result, putting pressure on music and arts education. So let's start with the first one. First one is federal funding. So with the federal funding, what's important to know is here come the cuts, right? So it starts at the federal level. Now, to put it in perspective, federal funding is only 10% or less of all funding in education, but the funding plays an important role. And where we've been lucky is that the cuts that were proposed for FY26, we were actually able to keep in place. Advocates fought for and kept the funding in place, largely because they didn't actually pass a budget bill. They just rolled forward the budget bill that they had passed in 2025. So as a result, they kept all of those numbers the same. So the NEA was preserved, NEH was preserved, the Museum Library Services was preserved, the Assistance for Arts Education was preserved, and all the federal titles were funded. When we look at the proposal for this year, which came out in April 3rd, you can see that the NEA is going down almost 90%, so that they can be in wind down status. Same thing for NEH, same thing for Museum and Library Services. They're getting money to close their operations. In the meantime, Title II, Title 4A, Title II, Title 4B, and the Assistance for Arts Education have all been zeroed out. Now, this is a proposal, but this is what's worked. This is the administration's proposal that is now working its way through Congress. So that's something to certainly pay attention to. But also interesting was the fact that in the One Big Beautiful Bill, they put $257 million into renovations for the Kennedy Center, yet they're closing all the other cultural organizations. And now we also know that the Kennedy Center is going to be closed for at least 2 years to go through all of those renovations. So in 1991, the word was extracurricular. In 2026, the word is distraction. And in 2027, the budget puts into place what they mean by it by zeroing out a lot of the cultural funding that is there. As a result, those funds, the loss of those funds, particularly as it relates to Title IV and the Assistance for Arts Education, as well as some of the funds from NEA, because NEA grants do support the programs of organizations that work in schools, all of that is in jeopardy. And if that goes away, either the programs that they support go away or the funding has to come from somewhere else. So that's what's happening on the federal level. I tend not to pay as much attention to the federal side of it historically because it's only been 10% of education funding. But as we walk through these next couple items, you'll see how federal action outside of education can really impact what's happening with funding. And so the next one I want to talk about is threat two, which is the One Big Beautiful Bill or the $1 trillion state budget bomb. And what I mean by that is the way that the One Big Beautiful Bill is having an impact is that it's putting the squeeze on the states. And the state budget squeeze comes from the $1 trillion cut to Medicaid over the next decade. Medicaid in New Jersey is significantly subsidized by the federal government. Medicaid in New Jersey is about $7 billion a year of state allocated funding, in addition to about $20 billion in federal funding that supports it. Because we spend about $25 billion on Medicaid every year in the state of New Jersey. A big chunk of that, or the majority of that, comes from the federal government. Well, what happens if the federal government decides they're going to cut $1 trillion out of Medicaid offsets? That means that those cuts come down to the state, and those cuts are going to hit New Jersey's budget pretty significantly. In addition, $186 billion in SNAP cuts, the food program cuts, those are also happening. And again, that funding helps support what the state's budget to support the SNAP programs in our own state. Additionally, there are 23 states that are projected to run deficit spending or that have budget funds that are declining for this current fiscal year that we're in right now. And there's a $3 billion shortfall in the next fiscal year for the state of New York by itself. Right? So we know they're getting hit by $3 billion. We haven't seen what the cut is going to be for New Jersey yet, but this gives you a sense of, geez, there's a big pot of money that's going to be impacted in our state budget. And if that money goes away, either the program gets cut or the money gets taken from somewhere else. And what is the number one bucket of spending in the state of New Jersey? Education. So that's how these things fit together. So federal cuts then drive a budget squeeze that then puts pressure on district's general fund, which then could target your program. So again, not trying to scare you, trying to make sure that you are looking at things with your eyes wide open. In addition to that, the One Big Beautiful Bill also eliminates the amount of money or reduces the amount of money that students can get loans for when they go to college based on their degree. So if you're in a professional program like law, medicine, dentistry, you're allowed to have a higher level of federal funding for your loans. But if you're not in the professional programs group, if you're a standard graduate tier, which arts education, master's and doctorate degrees and undergraduate programs, they all fall into the standard graduate tier. So that limits the yearly amount to $20,000 or $100,000 over the lifespan of the loan. So important to understand that this policy implication is actually going to impact people who are trying to come into the profession as well. And that then leads us to our third threat. And that third threat is the cost spiral, or what I like to say is everything gets more money, everything gets more expensive, except for your budget. And that's because between tariffs and healthcare and food and energy and did I mention there's a little war going on right now that is also driving up the cost of gasoline, which is then driving up the cost of everything because in order to get anything from point A to point B, you have to pay for it to be able to move, which means gas. So it gets more expensive to move things around. But let's just take one example. In the music products industry, they paid $627 million in tariffs last year. $627 million. Their imports fell by 10.7%. And as a result, we're seeing costs for those products go up that schools have to pay for. And even though the tariffs were struck down, or the one version of the tariffs were struck down, that within days, a new tariff was put into place for a 10 to 15% global tariff. And the tariff that they have on Chinese goods was still in effect. It was never impacted by the particular tariff that the Supreme Court ruled as being unconstitutional. But the effective impact is woodwinds, brass winds going up 25, 27%, right? And that's just one small fraction of school supplies. But what about other things? What about, if they're putting up a new building or they're buying new furniture or anything else, everything is getting more expensive. And you throw on top of that, we've seen healthcare increases 15, 20, 25% in some districts. These are the things that create problems for school boards when they're trying to figure out how they are going to fund the district. Now, the Supreme Court may have retired this one tariff instrument, but the orchestra remains because there are so many different other tariff instruments that the administration is using that they just replaced the one that got struck down with another one. So everything remains high. The cost of everything is going to remain high or continue to increase in cost as long as those tariffs are in place. So that's something to keep in mind, that this is impacting everything that's going on in education. The fourth threat that I want to talk about is the enrollment cliff. This is something that not a lot of people are paying attention to, but it is a really important reality because per pupil funding is what drives funding in education. And if you have fewer pupils, you have lower level of funding, and that can lead to program cuts. So, for example, it's important to understand this can actually impact your feeder pipeline because the pipeline is shrinking. And maybe some of you are already seeing this in the size of the grades that are moving through, or the number of classes where maybe you used to have 4 classes for first grade and now there are 3 classes for first grade. those are leading indicators of a shrinking population, and that can eventually impact your program as those lower numbers work their way through. So, for example, here in the state of New Jersey, between 2022 and 2031, there's going to be an 8.3% decrease in the number of students attending schools in the state. That equates to about 114,000 students, 114,000 fewer students in the state of New Jersey by the time we get to 2031. So this is not somewhere else. This is not theoretical. This is what's happening to the student population here in New Jersey. But when we look at it across the nation, we're going to lose 4 million students by 2031. 4 million students, from 50 million to about 46 million. And as a result of that, we're already seeing what's happening in other pockets of the country. Houston ISD is closing 12 schools, voted unanimously in February of 2026 because of declining population. Cleveland Metro, 29 schools, including the fact that half of the high schools in Cleveland no longer offer music education. Broward County cut 6 schools to consolidate because they had a $94 million budget hole and 50,000 empty seats in their building. Atlantic Public Schools has 16 buildings that they're closing as a result of the declining population. In Alabama, they're losing about 5,800 students just in a 1-year drop. It's the steepest drop that they've seen in 40 years in the state of Alabama. And in California, I talked about 4 million students. Well, the state of California is actually losing a quarter of those. 1 million students are going to disappear from the rolls in California public schools. And it's not just related to the student enrollment in traditional terms or the birth rates, because what's driving a lot of this is declining birth rates. But there are other things that are happening that are also leading to declines in student population. Some of the things that you wouldn't expect. And one that just happened over the last 2 weeks is in Austin, Texas. Austin, Texas has a significant budget deficit that they're facing because they lost 3,000 students from their system almost overnight. And what drove 3,000 students from the system in Austin public schools? ICE. The fact that they were having ICE raids around the community, parents became fearful of sending their students to schools. And as a result, they had 3,000 less students appearing in their schools. And when they did their census that they then used to calculate how much money they're going to get for their district based on their student count, that led them to be 3,000 students short. So this is really, some of these policies that you think don't have anything to do with education can have significant negative impact on education. And Austin, Texas is a perfect example of that. But here in New Jersey, you need to pay attention to what's happening in my district. What are the demographic projections? Every school district has demographic projections to understand what's happening with their enrollment. You would want to get ahead of that. You'd want to find out that information to see, is this going to be a problem for me in my district or not? Because not every district is going to have the same issues, but there is information that you can look at right away. And I would suggest you look at the latest demographic study for your particular district to see what the projections are there. The next one, threat 5, we're going to talk about is the educator pipeline. There are not enough music and arts teachers in the United States, period. We're getting it from 2 different directions. Not only are we getting it from the grant terminations, for students that are going in, not only are we getting it from Grad Plus, but there are just fewer students that are going into education for music and arts education for this conversation, but education in general. As a matter of fact, there's about 411,000 jobs that are currently unfilled or they're filled by uncertified personnel, meaning 1 in 8 positions in the United States is being unfilled or filled by an uncertified teacher. So that's the reality of what we're facing. 24 states plus the District of Columbia list music and arts among the teacher shortage areas. That means that they're a priority area for the state. Now, it is not identified as a priority area for the state of New Jersey, but we are seeing the same issues with smaller number of students going into our colleges and universities to take degree or to major in music and arts education. As a fact, in fact, over the last 10 years, there's been a 14% decline in the music education degrees that have been conferred over the past decade. Yet we know that there's an annual attrition rate of 14 to 20%. And we know that across the country, there's about 140,000 music educators. So if we're losing, just for math's sake, let's just say 10%. If we're losing 14,000 teaching positions every year, we're only graduating 4,000 students with music education degrees every year. So in this case, the math isn't mathing. We're losing more teachers than we're actually graduating through to come into the system. And that's why you start hearing conversations about alternative certification and other ways to try to make up for that. What's important to understand is for veterans, the chance that your position is going to be filled by a fully prepared educator is declining. And for early career teachers, you too are increasingly rare and also more valuable than you realize because of the fact that, there are fewer fish than are needed to fill up the pond in education. So something to keep aware of. It is very real. Again, it's more acute in other parts of the country, not as acute here, but it could become acute here very quickly. So it's something to pay attention to and something to think about when you're preparing to fill an open position in your district about where do you go to find those teachers. And remember, I talked about the fact that California, they're
What do I have?
they need a.
Passport. Yeah, it's blue 2025. They just finished the oil change. It's no rush.
There we go. So one of the things that in California through Prop 28, they're having to hire about 11,000 teachers as quickly as possible. So they're starting to advertise in other states. So not only do you have it that it's a shortage area, but you now have states that are going to begin trying to raid other states for their educators in order to fill the positions. So again, not as acute here in New Jersey, but something to pay attention to. What is something that should be very high on your radar screen is curriculum narrowing. This is where music and arts get eliminated without anyone deciding to eliminate it, right? It happens because of a narrowing of the curriculum. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to give you three separate examples that are happening in other states. So there's the direct elimination process, which happened in Oklahoma. They had a 1 credit graduation requirement in the arts, just like we do here in the state of New Jersey. But effective in this current school year, districts will be able to decide whether to offer arts at all. They've eliminated the graduation requirement. Therefore, at the high school level, there's not a requirement for them to teach the arts any longer. So that's a problem. And that was done in the name of workforce development. We want to align all of our courses around workforce, and we need to prepare students for jobs and careers that are going to pay them really well. Oftentimes ignoring all the research that music and arts education actually develops the skills that our employers are looking for. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Downgrading it to an elective. So in Indiana, they actually came out with a new diploma program where they downgraded the requirement for arts education to an elective requirement. And as a result, it's now a personal elective, but counselors are steering students toward employment and enrollment honor seals, which ends up scheduling out the arts programs. All right. Again, this is all in the name of workforce development. And in Indiana, they were talking about their particular diplomas as as being employment, enrollment, and enlistment. So to work, to college, or to the military. And that's the way a lot of states are talking about this stuff. We need to make sure that our pathways are clear so that students get a job, go to college, or enlist in the military. And whether you agree with it or you disagree with it, this is a model that's out there that other states are beginning to look at. And then in Ohio, they have the CTE exemption loophole, where 2 semesters of fine arts are still required for graduation or a 1 year graduation requirement, similar to our 5 credit graduation requirement here in New Jersey. But state guidance exempts students completing a CTE course of study. So if you're on a CTE pathway, you don't have to take the fine arts. So more students qualify for the exemption, and therefore fewer students are enrolled in the arts. And as a result, programs begin to disappear. So it's important to understand that the scheduling threat is the quietest one, but it doesn't arrive as a budget cut. This is a policy that is being changed at the state level. So it's really important that you pay attention to what's happening at the State Department of Education. I've always said, going back to my days at Arts Ed New Jersey and when we first started, that the place that we drew the line in the sand was over the graduation requirement and the requirement of all 4 arts disciplines being taught. That's our protection. When you lose those protections, then it becomes up to the individual school districts on what they want to teach, what they want to provide, because those protections that we had in place are no longer there. That's what we've seen happen in other states. That's what I'm encouraging you all to protect vociferously here in the state of New Jersey. And then threat number 7 is state tax reform. And this is where property tax cuts and vouchers strip billions away from school budgets. Tax relief happens at the top of the system. Program cuts happen at the bottom of the system. And here are a couple examples. We talked about Indiana. In addition to what they did with their graduation requirements, they just passed a new bill of a new program of how they're funding education. So it changed the way property tax credits and farmlands were assessed, and it created a 3-year impact on the school corporations. $744 million went out of their education system. $787,000 were eliminated just from one particular school district, or about 20% of their budget. Think about that in any of your own districts or any of the districts where you provide programs. What would happen if one day they woke up and somebody said you have a 20% budget cut? I mean, that would be devastating. And that's what's happening across the state of Indiana. You're seeing the share of spending going from 2.7% to 2.1%. That it's an even lower share than it was going back to 2010. And that they're spending less than $100 per pupil than they were back in 2010, adjusted for inflation. And that they've also have passed a universal private school voucher system effective in the middle of this year. So the combination of property tax cuts plus voucher expansion plus the ending of the ESSER expiration, all of these things are compounding in the state of Indiana to really put pressure on their particular schools. Another example is in the state of Ohio, where they abandoned their funding formula, their reserve cap, and now they have record vouchers. There's a $2.7 billion shortfall because the legislature decided to get rid of their fair funding formula plan. They needed $3 billion. They only got $281 million, or about 10% of the money that they needed. 448 of the 609 districts are going to receive less money than they had before, proportionately or disproportionately impacting low-income schools. 40% of the new cap on district cash reserves. We actually went through this in New Jersey back in 2010, 2011. when the state government under the Christie administration came into school districts, and if you had reserves beyond a certain level that they were looking at, they just took all that money away from you and put it back into the state coffers. The school district where I was on the Board of Education, they came in and took $4 million out of our reserves. And just like that, our safety net disappeared because the state took that money to fund other initiatives. And then they reduced funding by $2.75 billion, and then they put $2.4 billion into voucher programs. So they're taking money away, and then they're incentivizing students to leave the system. So districts are getting a double whammy where the state's taking money away, and when students leave their system, the students are taking money away, and that then has this compounding effect. And this is a pattern that's beginning to play out nationally with the tax cuts and the voucher programs. It's starting in Georgia, in Texas. There's a lot of concern over their programs, a state that's really well known for their strong music and arts education programs, and they are having severe challenges as a result of the tax reductions and the voucher programs. West Virginia, North Carolina, same playbook, different states is what we're dealing with. So tax relief at the top of the system translates into program challenges at the bottom of the system. And in school budgets, the bottom often means what's happening to our arts programs. So this is the compounding effect. The federal cuts then put pressures on district budgets with staffing reductions, programs shrink or disappear, enrollment declines further, the pipeline shrinks, we've got fewer career arts educators, and as a result, we just get into this spiral that can have a negative impact on our program. So the barrier isn't student interest, it's access. Where students have access, students actually are engaged and performing well. But access is under systemic threat from all 7 directions that we just talked about here. And what we know from the Arts Education Data Project is where access exists, participation remains strong, even in underserved communities. So it's really important that you understand that where programs are present, when students have the opportunity, they take advantage of the opportunity. But what all this is pointing to is a reduction in opportunities for our students. So the storm is here. There's no doubt about it. We've been hearing about it from calls across the state of New Jersey, recent cuts that are going on in Verona, down in Galloway. They just dodged a bullet down there and were able to advocate and push back on some proposed cuts that they were successful in defeating. And we're hearing about this all across the country. The question is whether, like we did in 1991-92, whether the field will respond with clarity, coordination, and urgency that this moment demands. So before we go into some Q&A, I just want to hit quickly on how we go from defense to offense, right? So, all right, well, what do we do now? Well, now is the time when we begin to be proactive. And one of the things that I'm going to tell you right off the bat is this budget cycle is done. We're done. Budgets are due tomorrow to be passed. So, there's really not a whole lot that can be done left, except for the few stragglers that are out there that are still fighting some fights like up in Verona. But what you need to focus on is the next budget cycle. And that budget cycle starts right now. And that's where you need to be focused. And I'm going to show you where there are some tools are that you can use. But there are going to be 2 arguments that we use moving forward across the country. And I believe that they're true here as well. One is a strategic argument and one is a foundational argument. And the strategic argument is to focus on workforce skills, the skills that the employers actually say they can't find. Because we know the skills that they have articulated that they need are the skills that research shows that our students are developing in our arts classrooms. So we have to do a better job of making that connection that if workforce skills is a priority for you, then you really need to be investing in these programs because these are the skills that the research has documented that we're providing for those students. And I'll show you where to find that research. But most importantly, in closing the deal, is music is valuable if music is only valuable by virtue of employability, then an administrator can say, great, well, I can do this with a CTE course, or I can do this with some other course. The foundational argument goes deeper, and that's what do we gain? What do our students gain from being involved in the arts? And this is a quote that I make all the time. We don't teach music and the arts to create great artists any more than we teach math to create the next generation of mathematicians or language arts to create the next generation of writers. We teach the arts in our schools to create great people, empowered with the skills and knowledge to be successful in life and to do great things regardless of the vocational pathway that they choose. That is the foundational argument that we need to be making for why we're doing this in our schools. So you can tailor these messages to specific audiences, and you should always go into any advocacy situation knowing your audience and tailoring your message to that audience, not just having a generic message that you're going to share with everybody, but really tailoring it to the different audiences that you may be speaking to. With administrators, lead with operations data. We know that high school students in the state of Virginia that had 4 years of arts had up to a 50% lower chronic absenteeism rate than their peers. Chronic absenteeism is still an issue here in New Jersey. This is a way to address it. So it's important that this type of language that you can use with your administrators. With your faculty and colleagues, you want to build coalitions. Sometimes the CTE educators can be positioned as competitors, but they also could be partners. And so how can you collaborate with the CTE folks in a positive way? How can you build alliances with other folks within your school building to support the work? And then as organizations, how do we build better coalitions to address these issues within the state? And then for parents, what do the parents care about? What does this mean for my child? Right? And so we always have to talk to parents about how this benefits my student and what does it mean to them. And so it's important to understand that the infrastructure exists. The information, the tools, the data, the research is there. It's just up to you to use it. So we've got musiciseducation.org, and I'll show you some items there really quickly. We've got NJMEA and the also dance, theater, and visual art organizations in the state, the professional associations. They will have information. Arts Ed New Jersey, obviously Wendy and her team, they're creating lots of materials that you can use to support the effort. And if there's something else that you need, I'm sure they would be open to figuring out what it is that they can help with, develop to support that. And then there's the Arts Education Data Project. Arts Ed New Jersey has our dashboards up there for the state of New Jersey. We probably will have updated data in there for the 25 school year sometime in May. So use that data, understand what that data says about your district, and use that data to understand what's happening in districts around you and how you can then use that information to make the case for how you're moving forward. And then there's other resources from NAFME, NFHS, Music for All, Save the Music, the Grammy Museum Education Department, the NAM Foundation, Americans for the Arts, the Teach Music Coalition, all of these places that are available to you. But I just want to touch on two tools real quickly, and then we'll get to your questions. One is Music is Education. Go to musiciseducation.org. This is a state-focused advocacy work that brings together national and state organizations with the tools and information needed to address the issues that are popping up right now. And in addition to that, we've created an AI advocacy assistant with a curated knowledge base of the best research, data, arguments, knowledge that has been acquired over the years in all these advocacy efforts, put into one place so that if you can't get a hold of Wendy, or you can't get a hold of me, or you can't get a hold of somebody else, you can just go to Carl B., type in what your situation is, and Carl will begin to work with you on developing an argument for a school board, or a presentation for a superintendent, or a speech for a Kiwanis club, or provide you with the latest research on the impact of arts education on workforce development skills. You go into the chatbot, ask it that question, it will give you the information. So that's all ready for you. And then next Thursday, we're doing a celebration of advocacy wins, the Music is Education webinar. Uh, that's available. It's on May 7th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can register at the Music is Education website. So we encourage you to join that as well. So Monday morning, document. Document your program participation numbers, your student outcomes, and have that ready before anyone even asks for it. Know your data, know your program, know the impact that you're having before anyone even asks about it. Number two, identify. Identify your allies, your parents, your colleagues, your administrators who already get it, school board members. Now, I'm not saying you, music educator, art educator, necessarily contact the school board members, but your parents, other people can do it. Don't ever put yourself in jeopardy, but you're surrounded by people that can have those conversations to support you. And then engage with your state associations, with Arts Ed New Jersey. Know what the policy fights are for New Jersey so that know what's already underway and where your voice may be needed to address some of those. And then lastly, use every interaction with a parent, with a principal, with a board member, with a legislator, with a colleague, with another educator in your district to make the case of the value and importance of the work that you do. So for your principal on Monday, to your school board before the budget is set, to the state legislature before requirements are even rewritten, and to parents before they assume someone else is handling it, be sure you are prepared with the information to support them. And so, in closing, I just want to leave you with this, and then we'll do some Q&A. Advocacy is not something that you do. Advocacy is something that you are. It has to be embedded in the way that you think in order to make a difference for your program. So with that, I will stop.